Jordan Haverson and I have spent a lot of time talking about how eco used to be, and a lot of times when we're having these conversations, we think this is a lot of stuff that people just kind of need to hear, right? Like, especially with your perspective from decades and decades in this space. And also, you mentioned that you had some of the examples of the old tech,
yes,
which I thought was from the 90s, and I was wrong. But it's from the early 2000s.
There is tech from the 90s. I was not around at that point in time, so we would need somebody older than me to come in and show that tech. But I do have some of the original tech from where the industry really started to gain some steam, which was like the mid 2000s, early 2000s, all the way through to, I guess, close to today.
Yeah, okay. And one of the things that I'll be presenting on in my session later also is some of that history of ECOA. And so in, I think it's the, 1998 until around 2013, it was this emergence, and it was really driven by people who were really, really close to it every day. It was when it was a lot more science and a lot less tech, and the tech was the limiter, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's true?
Yeah, tech was an enabler, I would say. So it wasn't necessarily a limiter as much. Because in those days, again, you have to turn back the clock. It's hard to imagine at this point, but there was really no reliable internet. There were modems that you could use. So even the tech that was being used to collect this stuff, it was being used outside of the clinic, and it was stored locally, and then you really didn't know what data you got until you brought it back into the clinic, and which point in time a cable was connected and it was uploaded, to the net at that point in time.
Yeah.
So it was just a different way of working, and you were really blinded to the data. The main aspect of it that was in play at that point was really the science around it. So making sure that we were able to get the proper data from the patients based off of the questionnaires that we were asking and the alarm functionality that had been studied and best practices around those things. And then the tech was just there to kind of do these basic, simple things. It was also a simpler time. You had very few devices in your life in 2005 that beeped at you on a regular basis, right? It was like you were in the BlackBerry time, if even that. And not everybody had an iPhone. The iPhones weren't even here yet. So when you had these devices that would beep at you and say, hey, it's time to make a diary entry, generally speaking, that was one of the few devices that you had that did that, especially if you were talking about an older population, which was one of the main questions we used to get back in those days was, I could see how my teenager could use this Palm Pilot device, but there's no way my grandmother could use this device.
Well, what's interesting is we still get those questions now, and a lot of what I was talking about when I first entered the ECOA space like 5 or 6 years ago was my parents got iPhones, when they were my age now, right? And so we're talking about different kind of considerations as far as, is this something that, older populations will be able to use? Like, they're using cell phones every single day now. But if you had to have this concept of having like a mini computer in your pocket, or I guess in some cases what you've got would never fit in a pocket, that is a lot more of a learning curve to be thinking about.
It was different too, because you have to think about it, the grandmom today who's used to having the iPhone, like you said, even though we still get that question today, I think people can be a little bit more reasonable in terms of their own experiences, like, oh yeah, my grandmom has an iPhone too, and yes, she's decent with it, right? She can do FaceTime or whatever the case might be. Back in those days, it was like, no one had a Palm Pilot, right? Certainly the grandmom didn't, and it didn't really serve any other purpose. So it was like, can we really use this, and would it really be successful? And it really was. In fact, as I remember correctly, the compliance with a population over the age of 60 with these old devices was actually several percentage points higher than your typical norm population.
Did you ever find, so this was something that I encountered when I was in that kind of parallel non-ECOA space but doing research on the ground, and one of the things that people were concerned about was that somebody might participate in a trial because they wanted a device, like because there was concern about theft, but more like I wonder how that functioned as a motivator for some people or not.
So the devices were fully locked down back in those days. So if that was your aim, you would be very disappointed when you got the device and realize that the only thing it can do is ask me about my urination event over the past 24 hours, right? Not exactly what I was looking for. I can't play a game on it, even these primitive games compared to what you might have today. It just wasn't available on the device. there was some thought always, and probably even to this day, around giving devices to the patients at the end of the studies. And there were always concerns about that from an FDA perspective, and does that make sense, and is it a bribe? And the industry never really solved for that. So I don't think that became ever mainstream where devices were able to be kept by patients or sites. But it was always a discussion that you would get in your capabilities meetings. Come up fairly regularly.
Well, let's see some of the devices.
Yeah, sure. So we'll go in a unique order here. So let me dig up these first two. So again, these are not the original devices, but this is close to it, right? This is the Palm E2, an early stage Palm device. Again, there's no connectivity in this. It sat into a cradle, which I do no longer have. The cradle had a cord that plugged into your laptop, and it could upload the data that way, so that a patient would basically be given one of these. It was programmed with the exact specifications for the eDiary. They'd go home for a period of time, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. They'd collect all of their entries. It would beep at them when they needed to. They had to remember to recharge the device. And then they'd bring it back in after that time, and the site would basically plug it into the site cradle, and it would then upload the data. So it was pretty straightforward. Question we would always get from sites, even back in those days, or not sites, from sponsors back in those days, was, how do we know how compliant the patient's going to be, and why do you trust that? And the easy answer was always, well, we've studied it scientifically. We have so much data around the use of these devices in the field that we know what success looks like. So we should expect that when that data is, even though we're going to be blinded to it for a 3-week period, when they do come in and upload that data, we should expect it to be 92, 93% compliant. And that was true globally across all of the different studies that we ran. So it was pretty neat. And there was always this push, especially as cell phones started to become more of a real thing, and then smarter phones became a real thing. Like, we want to be able to see that data. There was always this lack of trust, an unwarranted lack of trust, that when you were in that blind period before the data was uploaded, that it wasn't being collected properly. And so, people always wanted us to get to that spot. And so we got there. First thing we came up with, I don't have it with me, but it was like a cradle where this would sit in, and the cradle had a SIM card in the bottom of it and a little antenna. And so it would connect to a cell tower, and basically very slowly it would connect to the internet and transmit all of the data. After this device, we came up with, I think there was a big push beyond, so the eDiary, check it out. It still works.
It's not, it's not like
no, it's actually smaller than some of the devices today, but it was limited in what it was able to do. So what this couldn't do effectively, and again, you have to go back in time here. So in the mid-2000s, EDC was really just starting to hit the mainstream. And it was struggling a little bit because, not for anything EDC was doing incorrectly, but because the internet telecommunications was just not there yet. So you were still using 28.8 modems and 56K modems to dial in, and if you, all of a sudden, some of you who are watching this who are on the, maybe as old as me, you would remember this, if you got a bad connection, you might be submitting a demography form, you'd hit submit, and then you'd get the spinning globe, and then you'd just get a white page, and you weren't really sure, did the data I just entered, did it actually get uploaded or not? And it wasn't stored in like a central cache or anything like that. So EDC really started to gain a rapid adoption once the concept of, continuous high-speed internet connectivity became a thing, which was towards the late aughts, right? And into the 2010s. Now, when that started, though, the big premise around EDC was cleaner data faster. And so if you were using EDC to collect all of your CRFs, well, and then all of a sudden you had all these SF36s and EQ5Ds that you collected on paper. It was like, I can't lock my database, I can't even do my queries until I have actually, double data entry and do all of that stuff that you were just trying to get away from by using EDC. So then it became, hey, eCOA companies, can you guys help me out here? I need to be able to collect this stuff electronically as well. Otherwise, it's actually slowing down all of the promises associated with EDC. So this is an embarrassing device. It never really took off, but this was the first attempt at that, right? So we came up with this old Dana device. I think it was used for school kids. in somewhere, and someone found this. Dave Rosa, if you're watching this, a shout out to you. He uncovered this. It was before my time, and it just was basically a palm device. So it was just like this, but it had a much larger screen.
Fits in your palm.
Yeah, right. Now again, this wasn't meant to go home with patients.
Okay.
It lived at the clinic, right? So it was made for an SF-36. So where you had longer assessments with more choices, where just the screen real estate of a device like this wasn't conducive to capturing those things.
Okay.
So you'd capture them on something like this. But it was clunky. The keyboard was always inoperable. People always had questions about that. But it attempted to serve a purpose, but it not super well. And no other vendor, except for the one that I worked for, copied this. It was a very copycat industry. Lots of people copied this device. Nobody copied this device. So that led to, and it won't do it justice on the camera, but some of you watching.
This is so heavy.
This thing is so heavy. And we used to have to lug this thing around and demo it. But it's basically just an old Windows laptop. And it was used in the clinic to basically collect the in-clinic assessments, the EQ5Ds, the SF-36s, the QLQC30s, right? It still works. God, I mean...
Thank you, goodbye.
Yeah, right. The battery's low, so it doesn't quite hold charge like it once did 20 years ago. But it was able to successfully capture the eCOA data in the clinic, which then helped facilitate the use of EDC.
I mean, it's not that bad, and you can see how in some ways the size of the screen is better for some populations, right? I mean, some of the challenges that we run into now is the configurability of things, right? And so figuring out, do we zoom in, zoom out? Of course, we should be doing that. That's an accessibility thing.
Yeah.
It's going to hibernate. Okay, wow, that is just a regular computer. That's just Windows XP.
Yeah, it's Windows XP, and then they loaded some firmware on top of it, so it booted right into it. Yeah. And again, somewhat locked down, so you couldn't just go into Windows and use it for Word.
Right.
So every device that we had always shipped was always locked down for the specific purpose of the eCOA data capture.
And so this is Site Pro. So did you say this is not going home with patients?
No, it was not going home with patients. Now, people would ask for that because even in those early days, you were thinking about Parkinson's subjects sometimes, and we need a bigger device than this to go home because they may have trouble hitting the target areas depending on how their tremors might be. And so there were always questions about it, but obviously that thing is just too big and bulky, and it was expensive too.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
To send home with people.
Yeah.
So you'd reuse them from one study to another. I mean, these devices got reused for many, many years across many studies. Some sponsors never wanted to stop using them. Yeah. And this was around 2009. So again, right around the same time that your metadata, your phase forwards of the world really started to get their rapid adoption, because now internet connectivity and reliable high-speed internet connectivity was a thing. So the need for this was really important. Ironically, in hindsight, it kind of also started, in my mind, the lack of scientific approach to eCOA that had existed up until that point.
Okay.
So up until that point, you were mainly worried about, like, how is the patient going to interact with this? How do we make the alarms such that we can actually know what success looks like? What is success? How do we apply intervention methods if there's not that level of success? And then all of a sudden with this stuff, where it's in a controlled environment like the clinic, some of those scientific things that you were putting so much heavy lifting to with the take-home devices, they were not required anymore.
Yeah.
It's like if I give a piece of paper to you and say, hey, complete this SF-36, or I give you this big bulky tablet and say, complete the SF-36, and you're in the clinic, you're going to do it. So there's not a compliance story anymore. Yeah, there's some skip logic that's built into it. You're not going to have the legible entries, in the margins that you might have with paper. But generally speaking, it's a much more foolproof solution than would be the take-home diaries. But they were both called eCOA.
Okay.
And so ironically, like, you started to see this shift. This is not scientific data, but just in my own mind, you probably had 90% of the studies up until 2009 where they were take-home eCOA diaries. So every eCOA vendor playing in the space was primarily doing take-home diaries. And then once this high-speed internet connectivity took off, you saw that starting to slide closer to 50-50 over time. So it was a unique shift in the industry, and it's kind of persevered until today because both of them have the same names, whether it's in the clinic or take home. They're both called eCOA. but the value proposition of both is different. And the scientific rigor that might be required to succeed and even determine what success looks like is different depending on whether you're doing something in a controlled environment or in a remote environment.
Yeah, and that's the thought that I had when you pulled out that Dana device too, because I could see how that might actually be friendlier to some of the complex ClinROs that are really hard to roll out using eCOA now, because you've got to be able to type, or the conversations that will really stump eCOA are how do we implement this thing that requires the doctor to be able to flip back and forth between pages, or to be able to have those notes, right? That it's really hard to do on a phone.
Especially with ClinROs. Yeah. So less with pros. I mean, with pros, you were always trying to limit the ability for flexibility. So there'd be questions from sponsors often, like, can we add free text? Can we do this? Can we enhance the instrument? And usually the vendors at that time would instruct them no. Because now it makes it hard to compare the data from one patient to another, or from one site to another site, depending on how they're training their patients to respond to these things versus the other site. Certainly for ClinROs, where that's part of the instrumentation process itself, you need to then, if you're going to move that instrument from a paper version, paper modality, to an electronic modality, you have to be able to account for that flexibility and that functionality that existed in the paper world, because you want to try to replicate that to facilitate the doctor who's now completing this electronically versus on their notepad.
Yeah. Okay. Then now what we got?
Yeah, so this one, again, I skipped over this one. This is a Palm TX, very similar to the other device. The difference here is that it's a full screen device, so you don't have those arrows at the bottom where it was just blacked out. So this had more screen real estate than the other device, and some vendors, including the one that I worked for at that time, they were able to use this both for take-home diaries as well as in-clinic diaries. So they served a dual purpose. And sometimes you could flip the device like this for some of the assessments if you needed a 10 centimeter, a 100 millimeter VAS scale to be able to fit it onto here. And things along those lines. So it did give you some added flexibility, and it was nice sometimes to have one device. So if I was the patient, I'd get trained on this device, I'd go home for my 3-week period, maybe I transmitted the data through my wireless modem, maybe I didn't, and I brought it back in and transmitted there. But then at that clinic visit, the staff would go in here, they'd enter some code, and it would basically transform into in-clinic mode. So now it would present the SF36 or the EQ5D for that particular visit, for that particular study. And then once they were done with it, they'd set it back to patient mode. The patient would go home for the next 3 weeks, rinse and repeat, and do it again and again and again.
That's sounding more familiar. Like that's closer to where we are now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this device.
You've got like visit windows. You've got stuff that's being kind of scheduled in and sort of automated. But is the site's having to trigger this?
Yes, the site had to trigger it. Yeah, you didn't want the patient to have to go in there and do something on their own. You kind of wanted to remove any expectation from this patient doing something too robust.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They just wanted to, hey, if it beeps at you, it's time to do something. Yeah. Look at it. It'll be very self-explanatory. Do what you need to do, and then it'll shut up until it needs you to do something else again.
All right. Yeah. And again, that's the part that I think is so often missed, and it's one of my pet peeves, is that we really don't revisit how we do alarms and the amount of alarms that are going off now and the effect that they have.
Sure.
Super different than when you only had the one thing beeping at you, and it was part of the study that you were, it was this thing that you were doing, right? Sure. As opposed to it's just one other ding to ignore.
No, it was dedicated, right? So if this thing was beeping at me, it needed my attention, and it was pretty persistent. It would not shut up.
Yeah.
It would beep maybe for a minute, and then it would shut up for 3 minutes, and then it would beep again for a minute. So it wasn't something that you could easily ignore. And again, it was very successful at driving high rates of compliance, typically in the 91 to 93% range. Okay. The next thing, again, just to kind of go down the history road here, right? We started adding these sorts of things, right? So rather than a cradle at the patient's home where they might put this in, this is just a smart little modem. It's like a Wi-Fi repeater, so it would create a little Wi-Fi signal, which this thing would talk to, okay? And it has a SIM card in the bottom of it, and it connected to a cell tower. And basically, this would then send its data in real time to this. This would then transmit that data over the internet, that you did have that remote visibility from the patient.
So this is like a hotspot.
Yes.
And when is this from?
Probably around that same time frame, like that 2009. You could use it in the clinic, right? Because in the clinic, especially in those early days, like if you tried to just say, well, have the site connect to their own Wi-Fi, that was always problematic. It was like they needed a password, or some hospital settings were locked down and you couldn't get on their Wi-Fi. And you didn't really want to have a whole bunch of help desk calls associated with connectivity. So if you could control that to the best of your ability, you could reduce a lot of the noise associated with that aspect of it. And so just having your own hotspot that was connected to your own cell tower where you were responsible for that, it made it a lot easier. You eliminated a lot of the questions that you might have otherwise had.
Yeah, and that also goes to show how much the eCOA space was also focusing on the boring aspects of operationalization, but how that was absolutely critical. And one of the things that I hear now when we're talking to sites and running focus groups and things like that is that there are questions like this that aren't addressed anymore. So one thing that I've heard is that sites that have a radiology unit co-located nearby, they have really big problems signing on to the eCOA because of the interference. And there's lots of help desk calls, and they get kind of handed off to the other tier. But that's something that I've heard from sites that they're saying, we just make a decision not to do eCOA that day. We're not going to collect the PROs. And that's we really need that to not happen, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Or they'll make a decision that paper's better, and that is allowable, maybe, depending on the protocol, but it just creates more problems than it solves. And so there's this need to really listen to how things are going on at the sites and design around that.
Yeah.
You know?
No, it's funny you bring that up. There's a couple aspects to that just ring true. First off, in those earlier days of eCOA, we spent so much time physically at sites. So actually seeing what they were experiencing, because that's how you were able to come up with some of these solutions and even be aware of some of the nuances of what they were facing. Because if you're just talking to the sponsor, it's a very sterile environment, right? It's you as the vendor presenting to the sponsor about your capabilities, and they were usually interested in what's your cool UI look like, and show me the reports I'm going to see, like important questions. But there were a lot of assumptions and things that were taken for granted about what was actually happening at the site, because at the end of the day, the sponsors aren't using the device, nor is the vendor, right? The people who are using the device is the site, and then if the device is going home with the patient, well, now you're fully reliant on the site being comfortable and confident in the device themselves, so that if I'm training you, I'm setting you up for success when you leave the clinic. So you're not getting home and be like, I don't know what this thing is. They didn't do a good job of training me, or when they did train me, they weren't into it, and they told me it's going to blow up and it's going to be a disaster, and we're having so many problems with it. Like, it was really in the hands of the site to be able to set the patient up for success. And so we learned so much just by going to sites and seeing that. One of my favorite stories is when during one of those site visits, these old Palm devices, right, if you didn't keep them charged, they would actually revert back to their regular OS. So they had to have some level of charge, or you actually needed to basically flash your version of the software or the actual diary data onto the device, because it would just go back to a regular Palm, and that's not good for anybody. So when you would ship, let's just say 6 to 8 of these devices to a site, so they were on the shelf waiting for patients to be enrolled, the instruction was always to keep them charged. But each device came with its own giant wallboard, right? So it was hard to keep them charged. And we went to some sites, and you saw, like, they had PowerStrip plugged into PowerStrip, and they had all these wall warts, and it was taking up so much real estate, and it was just a big sloppy mess, not to mention being like probably a fire hazard as well. So sites hated it, but you wouldn't have known that if you didn't go. So we invented then after that, just a single device where it had one plug, and then off of that, like, it had an octopus cord. So it plugged in 8 of these devices at a single time, so they all stack on top of each other really nicely at the site. And now it was really easy to keep them all charged and just facilitate what the site needed to do to have success.
And that's one of the things that I've been noticing too, is that, like, it's so important to remember, but this is the time before kind of standardized charging cables too, so these guys are the same. But
as I was preparing to do this session, I was trying actually to see, which of these devices that I haven't used in 20 years would actually fire up. And some cords I couldn't find, some cords I did find. And it was funny to, like, do that. But each device, like you said, I was like, where's just the USB-C? Can I just plug that in and like charge them all up?
Yeah.
And it wasn't that easy.
Yeah.
Every device had their own proprietary charger, their own proprietary big block.
Yeah.
It's a pain.
And I imagine that was impactful as far as burden for both
For
patients
sure.
as well as sites. So
Absolutely.
we've all been there where, I'm at 2%, and it's easy to kind of scramble and find a
Correct.
cord. But that wouldn't have been the case.
No, but I think back then too, again, going
They
in that
lasted
time
longer?
machine. Not that they lasted longer, but you didn't have a phone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you did, it probably had its own proprietary thing anyway. So you weren't. We're used to that now, right? It wasn't until sometime later on where people started using the same chargers for the same devices.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I think we're really starting to see too the amount of iteration that was done by the eCOA vendor as they were developing this,
For sure.
figuring out what worked for the sites, going in, being, really shocked in a bad way about what the plug-in situation looked like. And so these were things that you were continuing to interrogate and address.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's eCOA science. That's a huge part of eCOA science.
It was a gigantic piece. I mean, again, as the vendor, especially in those early days, you were trying to create an industry. This was not something that was just going to live on its own. You had to push really hard. You had to constantly be educating the sponsors and responding to these skeptics out there around, will this device actually work? Why don't I just use paper? And so one of the best practices to be able to do that was to minimize the noise as much as possible, so you could focus on what really mattered, like patient compliance or the help desk calls that were coming across the study, and are they falling into one bucket or another bucket? Do we have a systemic problem that we might need to address for this particular study, or whatever the case might be? That's where you wanted to put your heavy lifting. You didn't want to have to worry about connectivity.
Yeah.
You didn't want to have to worry about devices being charged as much as possible. There was always going to be a corner case where those things crop up on any given study, but you wanted to spend the majority of your time, talking about the real stuff that mattered, the data collection in the field, and making sure that it was as easy as possible for the site and for the patient to have success with. If there was a higher burden on the vendor to be able to do some heavy lifting on the back end to make some of those things seamless, that was okay, because you were doing it for a reason.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine too, like as I was prepping for my talk later, I think in the early 2000s, it was only like 17% of studies even collected patient-reported outcomes at all.
Yeah.
And I assume that was also because it was really difficult to do, right? I mean, so there's the aspect that it wasn't required, and that there was more of a focus on biomarkers and things like that, which we've seen change a lot recently.
For sure.
But I have to imagine that it wasn't just a discussion about paper versus electronic. It was, do we do this at all?
Correct.
And how can it be less burdensome so that we can justify that inclusion?
It was, yes. And I think, just building on that, I think it was, can we do this at all? And then we didn't talk about it, but the old BMJ article where it was done, where it showed that parking lot compliance with paper diaries is roughly 11% versus an e-diary, which was 93%. Once that paper got out there and gained some traction, and people kind of understood and nodded their heads that made sense, and they could see that happening in their own study, well, then it was like, okay, if we're going to use PROS, we have to use eCOA or ePro. And if we have to use eCOA, well, then we really have to look at that. Is this thing ready for success just yet?
Yeah.
And different sponsors would come up with their own rationale as to whether it was or whether it was not. And some of them would say, it's just not there yet. I'm not going to do it until I can transmit data from home reliably. I need to be able to see this data in real time, and I will not get involved until afterwards. There were also, growing pains associated with the industry. At that stage, pre-2012, you had 3 primary vendors competing in this area, and all of them had very similar devices. All of them approached it from some companies leaned a little bit more into tech, but they all had a firm grasp on the science and best practices aspects of things. So they were all very similar in the way that they were playing the game, but they were all also struggling with funding issues.
Yeah.
And in 2008, there was a big financial crisis, and there was a lot more stress on some of those things that made it difficult to invest for all of those companies in scalability and future tech and rebuilding maybe a stale code base and things along those lines. So the vendors were struggling with different things as well during that same period of time, where the adoption was really starting to take off.
Well, I'm going to go back to the parking lot effect too. I don't know if I've ever told you this story, which is weird because of how often we talk about that BMJ article. But the first clinical trial that I ever worked on, I was a CRA, CRC, because it was a small center, and it was an emergency contraception study. And so the people who were coming in were there intentionally, right? Like they came to the clinic for emergency contraception. They identified that they needed it. But I could see from my office the parking lot. And so the deal would be that they had to come back 5 days later because it was a 5-day course of treatment that they were evaluating against they kind of could opt into this against the standard of care, which was, I think, a 3-day course. And I would see them filling out their diaries, one, but also popping the blister pack pills into the parking lot. And so they're not taking the medication, so they're not going to have the outcome that they're hoping for. But also that's giving us flawed data, and we're not understanding, right, what's going on. And one of the things that I do really appreciate about ECOA as a behavioral scientist as well is that not only is it not allowing that to happen, it's prompting the patient, hey, don't forget to take your medicine today, right? So there's a couple of things that it's helping with. It's helping with diary compliance, but it's also helping with medication compliance as well. And again, I think that that's something that's frequently forgotten, right? A lot of the questions that I get now are, what's the ideal recall window, right? What's the ideal window that patients can be filling this out? Because often the sites don't have to initiate that availability. That's something that we can program for ahead of time. And I don't know that all of the people who are asking those questions are thinking, hey, this is also a driver to compliance and making sure that they're not only recording their behavior when we're asking them to, but that they're doing the behavior that we're expecting of them, because that is how we know if our drug works or not, right? And that's something that I think goes by the wayside as we get more invested in the tech or getting faster or a little bit cheaper. Can you do this in 8 weeks instead of 10, right? But we really need to be making sure that those table stakes are still there.
It's removing the tech from it as a layman, right? And this is something that's always appealed to me about the industry. I view patient-reported outcome data as just so crucial, right? As a layperson, right? If I or a family member gets a disease, right? One of the things I would want to lean into as I'm researching, what drug should I take? Is there a clinical trial out there? What makes sense? What treatment options are there? Or how do they make me feel and function? Right? Less around like what are the biomarker data, things along those lines that might be a little bit more esoteric for the layman, right? But something I can understand rapidly is it improved my pain on a 7-day, or if I have a headache, it improved my pain within an hour, 90% of the time, right? And it improved it by half. Or I had to get up and go to the bathroom during the night, 17 times, and now it improved it down to 3, right? Or the pain that I felt in this area was this, and it was constant, and now it's only this, and it's less constant. Those are things that is patient-reported outcome data. That's data that you can only get by asking the patient these things. Now, again, the fact that you're using an electronic means to do that, sure, right? Because you can't trust people, as you just pointed out. You saw them doing the parking lot compliance. I know I would be a horrible patient if I didn't have something that was, basically making sure that I was being compliant with it. I would forget. We're all, especially now, we're all distracted with everything that's going on in our lives, right? So you wouldn't intentionally not do it, perhaps. But like you said, if you're not taking your medication, you're not completing the diary on time, well, then how are you trusting this data and actually making efficacy decisions or safety decisions on this compound? Right.
All these people who are taking this form of emergency contraception are getting pregnant, and we can't figure out why. Oh, because they're not taking the medicine. But the parking lot has 10 doses of the medicine just being crushed under tires.
Parking lot's definitely not getting pregnant.
No, parking lot's not getting pregnant. Do we have any other toys?
They start to get a little boring now because we start to enter more mainstream times, right? So now, fast forward, right now SIM cards are a real thing, cell phones are a real thing, the iPhone is out, right? You started to go to, this was a device that was popular for quite some time, right? So a bulkier, kind of more ruggedized cell phone. The industry at that point in time really leaned towards ruggedized devices because you wanted to be able to reuse them for as long as possible. So you wanted to maybe get 2 or 3 or 4 studies out of one of these devices where the patient would return them at the end and you'd reuse them. So this is a cell phone, again, fully programmed just to do e-diaries, but it had a SIM card built into it so it could transmit the data over the cellular network after it was done receiving the data. And again, it could take a hit. You could throw this thing against a wall, and you were probably going to survive. That Dana could really take a hit. I've dropped that thing 27 times. It's still ticking.
I dropped it today.
And then you move to like, everybody said, why do you keep giving me such, because this is where the convergence of kind of consumer tech and eCOA tech really started to come together. You could get away with things like this, you know, for a period of time, and then you could get away with things like this even for a period of time with real explanations like I just gave. Hey, we want it ruggedized, we want it to last longer. But eventually people are like, look, I got my iPhone here, I got like my iPad, I don't need this big bulky thing. Like, it looks weird. And the consumers now, my patients, they're not going to be very receptive of carrying this thing. Right. You know, when they're used to carrying something that's super slim. Right. Like, ironically, as slim as something like this, right? And so this was another one. This is a smartphone, right? Where just dedicated device. You'd ship this out. It had just the eCOA data loaded onto it.
I can hear the alarm from this phone in my head. I think this was I had this, it was my field phone.
Oh, yeah?
In Senegal, I think. And,
yeah, they were made to be annoying. Yeah, that's for sure.
Surprisingly heavy. It's, I guess, a huge battery.
Yeah. I mean, that was another thing. You wanted, as best as you could, you wanted to control the battery life. So a bigger battery was more important than having, you know, the best RAM or the best processor, because you weren't really using this device for much other than, you know, collecting some basic diary data. Try to see if I have anything else.
Mary Poppins bag over there.
Yeah, right. No, so I mean, and again, another device that kind of we moved into. This, I think, this came after this. These were by the same manufacturer, so they went from this big bulky thing to something like this. And then the world kind of started to transition into BYOD. Yeah. So there was always this push for it. Some vendors hit it a little bit earlier than some others, but there was just always this concept, much as, you know, we have this conversation with work. I think you carry two phones.
I do carry two phones. Yeah,
so some people like to carry two phones. They have their work phone and their personal phone. Some people like to have a single phone that does everything, like myself. You know, similarly, if you're participating in a trial, at least for a while, you had the option, like, hey, patient, do you want a dedicated device that's going to beep at you, or do you want me to load an app onto your personal device, and then you'll be responsible for doing those things? And there's pros and cons to both. Certainly something that was taken for granted, I think, until we moved to the BYOD model, was just you controlled the device. So if the patient, as they would, if they lost a device, or if they ran over it with their car, or fell in the swimming pool, whatever the case might be, they would call the site would give them a replacement device, piece of cake. If you lose your own personal device, and let's just say you don't have the wherewithal to just afford a new $1,000 phone, right? Maybe you have to go without a phone for a period of time, or you have to go back to a backup device. You know, all of a sudden that diary data that was relying on that app that was loaded on your device, you're not in control of that anymore. They can't just call the site and say, hey, I broke my phone screen or whatever happened. So you lost some of that control, which can introduce now some new noise into the equation when it comes to that main factor of getting compliant data from patients. Yeah, I remember I was looking at data to try to figure out like what the ideal breakdown is, and if there are certain people who would, you know, what patient preference has to do with things. I saw that there was one patient who had 25 different devices of their own, because I guess they were forgetful and they lost them. And then when they switched to a provision device, they were compliant throughout the rest of the study. And it was something that I was looking back at retrospectively, but obviously we're not thinking about that when we're advising sponsors on BYOD kind of provisioned breakdowns. We should be. We should be using our data more for things like that. That can be how eCOA science evolves, right? It's an area where I think eCOA science kind of left this area, that space, right? You kind of moved into BYOD because it made a lot of sense. And I'm not saying it doesn't, right? Again, going to the work phone analogy, I use my personal phone as my work phone, right? And I wouldn't have it any other way. I couldn't carry two devices. But if it were a clinical trial, right, and I was in the same situation, I would still probably have that preference. But you'd now put some of that burden on me and my payment of my bill and me not losing my device, and that could impact your overall compliance. Those questions weren't really asked when you made that transition. And so it was done for the right reasons, but I don't know that we as an industry necessarily understood, like, would you get higher compliance with certain indications or certain diary methods, like a once daily report or a twice daily report or a once monthly report, like would it be higher or different than it would be, if you had a dedicated device?
Yeah.
Then
that's something
having
that
a BYOD device?
Think about, like, what we probably should be thinking about what it is that we're trying to measure when we're making those suggestions, because if it's something that, there's a Parkinson's study that I'm working on where for a certain period of time, patients have to be completing a diary every 30 minutes for 3 days. So I would say in that case, even I would probably prefer BYOD, because I am just going to have one thing that's on me the whole time.
Sure.
Versus I'm doing it once a day, or once every so often. It's on my nightstand, and this is how I'm sure to pay attention, by developing a routine, by building it into my routine. And those aren't conversations that I hear, right? Like, oftentimes we're seeing the vendor selection, the eCOA vendor selection, happen separately from the science involvement that my team provides. And if we're lucky, we can be involved during scoping and to raise points like that. We've been successful in doing so a couple of times, but we've been really focusing on it for the last year. So I hope to see that really improve now that people are really understanding, like, hey, we're here so that you don't have to slow things down, right? We can advance the tech, we can do it in 8 weeks instead of 10. Like, if that's what the vendor can do, great. We're just here to make sure that you're thinking about what you ought to be thinking about, right? Because procurement isn't. So we've got all of these different kind of silos where these decisions are being made, and we need to be building a bridge to make sure that eCOA science is helping to influence the decisions, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit of turn back the clock, right? And I think the industry would benefit from that. We've become very tech focused, I think, as an eCOA industry, for great reasons, right? I mean, look at this old tech that we have here, right? Like, obviously, we have way better stuff today than this old stuff that, wouldn't hold a candle to some of the functionality that you have today, some of the capabilities of what you have today. But there's a science factor to every new thing that's introduced. And if the industry and the vendors who lead that industry are not researching these things and bringing forth best practices in terms of how to utilize these things, and what does success look like with this modality or with this change or with this type of a solution, it's hard to know exactly where you're having success and where success could be improved. And there can be a lot of missed expectations, I think, in terms of the sponsor as they evaluate the data, in terms of the vendor as the way that they might look at the data, even in terms of sites and what they're seeing in their world, and what the reality of the situation might actually be. It used to, there's a funny example, right? I may have shared this one with you before, but there was a sponsor that was hearing a ton of noise and feedback from their site because of low compliance. And in that case, I believe that sponsor was using a solution whereby it was using a dedicated device, right? So that was the only option. There wasn't BYOD in that particular study. And they were really angry, right? And the phone was ringing every 5 minutes, like, you need to fix this. And so they said, we need to have the patient's ability. The site's telling us we need to have the ability for the patient to use their own device, and that's going to increase the compliance level. And so started going through the motions, writing up a change order. It's going to cost you $1 million to add this functionality. It's going to take this amount of time, and so forth. And it was only after the fact where I actually looked at the compliance. I'm like, I'm just curious, like, what is the actual compliance that we're trying to improve on? And the compliance in that study, when I researched it, I think it was 96%.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that. That was when we first started working together, and it was high 90s.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And so, it's a sad story in a way, because you have a site that's frustrated, who's looking at this and assuming that this is really low compliance, and we're angry about it, right? And then the sponsor is listening to that, and now they're spending capital and time on this to say, what's going on here? And then they're yelling at the vendor, and the vendor's trying to pick it up and say, oh my gosh, we need to audible, the site's angry, the sponsor's angry. And at no point was anyone looking at this and being like, this compliance is amazing.
This is really good.
Yeah, you guys are having amazing success here, right? In fact, there's the potential that you might actually jeopardize the success that you're having right now by introducing a different modality.
Leave well enough alone. Yeah, and that's actually something that we find when we're doing our monitoring. So with our monitoring, where we look not just at ECOA for ECOA compliance, but we compare that against EDC, IRT, anywhere else that data are being collected to make sure that, like, if a visit happened in EDC, did it happen in ECOA? But anyway, one of the things that we find is that sponsors do have this tendency to treat all missed visits equally, or ring a 4-alarm fire, right? When a very tolerable amount of visits are missed. So treating everything exactly the same, not having the nuance to understand this is worth reaching out, adds to that burden, adds to burnout. And again, I think ultimately can result in sites just saying, no, right? We've got 30 different systems that we need to log into. I can't do anything right. It can't be 100%, but I'm not going to do it. And we need to get away from that too.
There's that expectation. Again, this didn't exist back in these early days, right? There was never an expectation that something was going to be perfect. And now there kind of is. And in many situations with other eClin solutions like EDC, for example, generally speaking, when you lock an EDC database, it is perfect. There may have been queries and DCRs and so forth that went through the process throughout the course of the study, but you generally don't have missing data. You've cleaned it all up. You've locked your database. Be it Central Labs, you don't have missing data, right? IRT, you don't have missing data. With ECOA, there's an easy assumption, especially if different vendors with these different disciplines have gotten involved in the ECOA space. There's perhaps an expectation that ECOA is the same. And in many ways it is. It looks the same. It is data capture. It generally follows the same development timeframes. The rollout of it might look very similar to some of these other solutions as well, but there's these nuances that we talked about today where these devices are going home with a patient. Right? They're going into an uncontrolled environment. Unlike the SF-36 piece of paper that I gave you, and then I gave you this big giant bulky tablet, and I'm expecting that you're going to do, independent of which one I gave you, you're going to be compliant with both of them. I know scientifically humans are only capable of so much, and so to not put that thought process into it and to have that expectation that things are going to be as perfect as all of these other eClin solutions that I'm rolling out can get you in trouble and actually can have you look at something that's super successful and judge it as a failure. And that's disappointing.
Definitely. Well, our 20 minutes turned into 47. Wow. So,
I need a part A and a part B.
I think so. I think this just turned into its own series. Anything else we want to talk about?
No, I think we'll leave it for next time. We didn't cut.